My name is Nigel Bagnall. I'm a senior lecturer in Comparative and International Education at the University of Sydney. I've been in education all my life, certainly as a student, and then in leaving school as a teacher. And in the last 15 years, I've been working as an academic. And I was very happy to move from being a teacher to being an academic and undertaking research. The research that I've done in the last 15 years has been guided primarily by my work in the classroom, and I believe heavily in following your instincts on what you should be researching. The first major research that I undertook was for my doctorate, in which I graduated in 1994, and that was a comparative study of the education in Australia and Canada as it related to the International Baccalaureate. From that work, I expanded when I became an academic and started looking at the French system of education, because I'd been teaching in France and I speak fluent French, and I looked at the bac technologique and the bac professionnel, which are two strands of the International Baccalaureate. And that guided my first major publication, in a sense, which was in comparative education. And really, I guess my research started from that time when I got recognition for my work. I spoke briefly the other day to you about publications in the last 5 years, and this now has developed more into books as themes for my work. And the first book that I ended up being involved with is called Youth Transition in a Globalized Marketplace. And that is involved with many stories from many different countries. It's an edited text, and I selected people from around the world to look at aspects of youth transition against the backdrop of le mondialisation, as the French say, or globalization, in which entry-level jobs have been taken, and these are the ones that were more often offered to youth. And I've looked at how people, when they finish compulsory schooling, move on to the next phase in their life. And that was a very personal study once again, and it was motivated by a period I had in France when I was asked by the parents of a French family, what should Benoit do when he finishes school? And I thought, man, if he was in New Zealand or Australia, I'd probably be able to help, but in that context it was a bit tricky, so, and to cut a long story short, that book came of that. The next book that I conceived was one, once again, for something that was lacking in the university system in Australia. It's become the #1 sociology of education text in Australia, and it was published in 2007, and it's already into its second publication because it's been so widely received. There were a number of issues that we dealt with at the University of Sydney in a very successful way, and we had a lot of experts in our university, and we also asked 2 outside experts in Australia to contribute to it. And that book, Education, Change and Society, as I mentioned, has gone into a second edition, but that was not really the one that I would like to spend most of my remaining academic work in, which is, firstly, it was an international schools book called International Schools as Agents for Change, and this combined my work with the baccalaureate, the French baccalaureate, and international schools, and it was the empirical research undertaken in that revolved around intercultural sensitivity. And it was a study that I did in 4 schools, one in Australia, one in France, one in Vietnam, and one in San Francisco. And I was interested in finding out how schools, which are more and more becoming international. I make a difference between an international school with students from all around the world and a local school, which may also have school students from all around the world, but it's more a national or a local school. Once again, with this backdrop of globalization, there is a greater movement of people, and schools, as a result of that, have to adapt more to the needs of those students. And that book came out last year, 2008, and it combined a series of interviews and small-scale ethnographic research into the culture of the schools and how they dealt with these issues of intercultural tension. Always difficult going into a school and saying, I'm here looking at intercultural sensitivity, and then having to prefix it by saying, not that I believe your school has problems in this area, because it's not always the case. And I noticed that you gave me a schedule of the questions, so there's something coming up on violence in schools, so I won't spoil that one. Just to conclude that my most recent project that I'm working on is one that has, as a New Zealander who's lived almost 30 years outside of New Zealand, this question of belonging, where do you fit in? And I've taken this into an educational context, and I have another contract with the people that did the youth transition book with Nova Science in New York, and it's called Education and Belonging, or as the French would say, Éducation et le sentiment d'appartenance, which means education and the sense of belonging, or the need to belong. The one on international schools, in interviews with students, especially a group I was doing a focus group with in Hanoi, they said that they had these dreams, and it was outside the scope of the study, but I realized it was significant. And one of them said that the sister would ring up and she'd wake up having this nightmare always about, she didn't know where she came from. She really didn't know where she belonged. So that prompted this desire, and I've looked also at, in the presentation tomorrow at the conference, I'll be talking about some other studies that I've been involved in particular in Australia at the University of Sydney, Indigenous educations, and looking at how we can hold these students in school longer. And I know in your own work that you've done something fairly much in the same ballpark, as we'd say, looking at why people from the favelas find it difficult to stay in school, and how we as schools, as institutions, can keep these relevant for them and make them want to be there. Because I think so often we push them away. In the sense of education, it's a feeling of being a part of something, or wanting to be part of something. And I talked about, for example, with Indigenous students, they don't feel like it's something that they want to take part in. They feel like it's something for somebody else. And they don't feel like it's from their culture, from their past, and they really don't feel like they have a place there. At its broadest sense, it's a feeling of having a position there, an identity that enables you to be in that place. And I think that schools have a lot to answer for globally in making room for all. And one of the themes of the conference is this inclusion or exclusion. And if we really are honest and want to include all students, we have to make it a place where they want to belong. One of the reasons I left the classroom as a teacher was that after you've done history, International Baccalaureate History 1 year, the next year it's the same. So what you end up doing is giving all the time. The the reason I wanted to get into academic work was to do my own research and do research in things that interested me. And one of the big things that interests me is this global identity. Since I did my doctorate in the early 90s, there's been much written about globalization and how that's impacted on all of our lives, and we can see it at a very superficial level with cultural things and with products like body shops are all around the world, McDonald's, McDonaldization and so on. What I'm very interested in, and through my work and teaching in international schools, is this notion of whether you give your allegiance to a country or to a global citizenship. In the parlance of international schools, they talk about third culture kids. Third culture kids, they might be born in Italy, taken to a school in Ethiopia, for example, where their parents are, and after some time they move on to somewhere else. And they are a third culture. They're neither Italian, because they haven't lived in Italy. They're not Ethiopian, because they don't come from there. And they're a third culture. So I was asked to write a chapter recently for a publication in the States, asking whether I found in my work that these international school students felt this global belonging or a national sense of identity. And I would say overwhelmingly that they felt like they needed to belong somewhere more local than global. They may be able to travel around the world effortlessly, and with money and a credit card you can do that pretty easily. But getting on a plane and going and living somewhere or being somewhere is not the same as identifying with that place. And I think it's Held who talks about the fact that there are no global pool of memories. For example, the events of 9/11, if we talked about that to someone from America and someone from the Middle East, we might find that they have completely different conceptions of what was taking place or what took place. But having said that, our sense of nationalism, for example, is very strong, and it's strong enough that it will lead people to go and fight and die for their country at some point, if push comes to shove and they need to. So this is what I'm interested in, this concept of global citizenship, and that's what, after education and belonging, that'll be the next thing. It won't be the last thing, because I'm sure that something else will come up that will drive me. But personally, I feel like once I've been through something and had a look and seen what's going on and done some sort of empirical research, I'm ready for the next thing. I recently did a study on Canadian primary schools that had adopted the International Baccalaureate Primary Years program. And the research questions underpinning that study were, if the International Baccalaureate is an international curriculum, what agenda are they pushing in their curriculum? And after going and visiting 3 schools in Canada, I realized that the International Baccalaureate Primary Years is really, it's a structure in which the content of the curriculum can be placed in there. And in Montreal, it's Canadian. The examples they use and the languages that they do. For example, they do second language teaching as part of the primary years program, and the language they do in Quebec is obviously French, and that's one of the reasons they chose it. So the education system, it used to be the case that its major job was this making Johnny in the States, Dewey was the one that came up with this. It was inculcation into the way of being an American, the flying of the flag, the allegiance to the Constitution and to the president or whoever in the States. It was a big part of what the education system was for. And schools, with the movement of people more and more, immigrants have moved for many thousands of years and always will, what we can see is that schools have a role in identifying what the essential criteria is for the country. For example, Australia, where I come from, what they teach in the schools and what they will let those who come from other countries bring to those schools. And in the past, for example, in Australia, they had a white Australia policy, so they only bring white people into Australia. So they had a pretty powerful agenda. And even now, when you go for your passport as an Australian citizen, they have a list of questions that they ask you, and you need to be able to identify some of the sporting icons in Australia. It's kind of weird, but that's the way it is. So, and the education system it's the interface of all of these the pressures of society, what government's trying to achieve, and what parents' expectations are. Formal education has a big role to play in that brief, creating the citizens of tomorrow.
Is there such a thing as a citizen, as a global citizen? Can we talk about it or not?
We can talk about it as an ideal, but I think, as I already mentioned about the global pool of memories, I don't think that there is. I mean, there are people who move around the world freely, but I believe personally that they have to identify with and belong somewhere in particular. That they can have maybe a couple of passports or many passports. I think I could have 4 if I wanted to. I already have 2. But that doesn't make you a global citizen. And it's a conception thing. What is a global citizen? What is a citizen? In Australia, they're very willing to let you keep your citizenship from another country if you join that country. Other countries don't. If you take up the citizenship of Brazil, I'm not sure if I'd have to give up my New Zealand passport. I know that in the case of America, for a long time, they wouldn't let anybody become an American citizen without denying their other one. So it was always. Now it's easier to hold multiple citizenships, but global citizen is it a reality? Maybe for a few people it is, but I still don't think that it means anything more than they have greater flexibility to go and work and live somewhere. I don't think. Issues like the environment are global issues, but I don't think there's many things that really people still want to wake up in the morning and read their newspaper, hear their radio stations, see their sports teams, and I don't think that we're going to ever see a time when everybody's as happy as in one place as they are in another. I think that certainly Indigenous Aboriginal students are probably amongst the poorest in Australia, and certainly by world standards, things such as their life expectancy and their health issues are fairly major confronting issues that Australia for a long time has turned their back on. It's only now that they have, even in the sense of made an apology to the Aboriginal people for the terrible history, even in the last 100 years. They used to take the babies away from the Aboriginal mothers and fathers because they didn't think that they were able to raise them, and they felt it was better for them to take them to a church mission and to raise them than to let them stay with their families. That's called the stolen generation. They talk about, in Australia, they have a thing called Australia Day, which is when Australia was settled by white people. Aboriginal people have lived in Australia over 35,000 years, and they talk about Australia Day as being Invasion Day. It's when the Europeans invaded. It was not the beginning of this place called Australia. Aboriginal people only got the vote in the 1960s. They couldn't vote up until that time, and so on. And you could go on. And it's only it was last year that the Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, made a formal apology for all of the past wrongs that have been done to the Aboriginal people. So they're the ones who, I talk about this tomorrow in my presentation to the group, that have the most to gain by profiting or getting through the education system and coming out the other side, and they need to have people who are leading them through that. On paper, yes, they do. They can go to schools and they can participate and they can go to universities, and there are a few scholarships and things made available to them. But the reality is that there are so many things stacked up against that happening, and so many different theories about how's the best way to proceed, that it is difficult for them. For example, many Aboriginal people live in cities, but many live in remote parts of Australia. The government decided to offer scholarships to elite private schools to get Aboriginal students out of their communities in the remote parts of Australia and come and educate them so that they could advance. But it was, in a sense, it's the next thing on from taking them away from their parents. I mean, with technology, you'd think that they could provide as good schooling in these remote places as they can in major cities, but it hasn't really worked out that way. So you get these Aboriginal students coming into these elite private schools. They mightn't see their family for a year or two. If they're lucky, they can get back at the end of the year, but it's not always straightforward. The health issue is a major one. Women and men have different life expectancies in both Aboriginal and the white population, but I think there's about a 20-year difference in the life expectancy. There are things like menace, it's a deafness that young Aboriginal students get, which is, once they get it, that's it for life, because they get a very simple infection in their ear. It's not meningococcal, it's, I can't remember the particular medical term for it, but there's a lot of things stopping their access to education and staying in school. As I said, there have been a few, but only a few scholarships and awards offered, but often even there. I mean, I have an Aboriginal student doing a PhD with me at the moment, and I can't find any scholarship or award that she can get. There are schemes such as the one of offering full board and lodging in private schools that would give a good education, but they then remove them from their local community. The government is trying, but if you talk to many Aboriginal people, it's not really moving in the right directions. I think the big thing to do is to talk to the Aboriginal people themselves and see what they would like, rather than imposing things from above, which has been the way. I think the history in the last 200 years has been that. I can say that as an outsider, and also from someone who looks in comparative way at other countries. I could talk about New Zealand, but I won't, because I don't want to tell you what I'm going to say tomorrow. When I was in Canada doing research for my doctorate, there was a bumper sticker that said, "If you think education is expensive, try ignorance." Ignorance, in other words, if you don't educate people and they are not aware of what's available to them, it's very, very costly. There's teachers who were going on strike, and they were trying to make a case, because education is always the first thing that the money is taken away from. I mean, I think education, it doesn't hold all the keys, but it holds many of the keys. In relation to the first question about comparative studies, for example, with Australia and New Zealand are very good comparators. They have many things that are similar about their situations. The native Maoris were there before the Europeans settled, and the Aboriginal people there before the white settlement in Australia. What I did for our faculty when we were trying to teach our teachers how to teach Indigenous students, and many of them had never met them, was we went to New Zealand and we saw how they do it over there. We found a completely different picture. New Zealand, a country of 4 million people, they had an apology, if you like, or they had a contract from when the Pākehās first invaded New Zealand, called the Treaty of Waitangi. So there was always a situation which acknowledged that the Maori people were there and the Pākehā people were there, and they went on from there. So that's over 200 years before. It's taken Australia over 200 years to reach that point. The previous Prime Minister, John Howard in Australia, wouldn't give an apology because he thought it would mean an admission of guilt and they'd have to do something about it. There was much Maori language spoken in New Zealand schools. There are some primary schools where they teach in Maori all the way through primary school, and then they do English as well. There is a university which is in Maori, the Maori tongue. There's only 10 or 12 universities in New Zealand, and one of them is entirely in Maori. When people read the news on the television at night, they introduce it firstly in Maori and then in English. When you visit a school, you see many symbols around, painted symbols on the walls and so on. Most of these things, when I look back now on this project that I started 3 years ago at the University of Sydney, most of those things are completely lacking in Australia. New Zealand seems to be about 40 years ahead in terms of integrating their not just Maori but Pacifica. The students from Samoa, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, all of the Pacific Island countries come and live and work in New Zealand, and they are integrated more fully. So that's, I think, how you can draw comparisons. You look at Indigenous groups in one country and another, and you see what is it? What are the things that are making the fact that there are many Maori politicians, there are Maori doctors, there are Maori everything. In Australia, it's very rare to find those leaders.
How do you think educational research can address those inequalities?
It can help to find what are the things that are keeping, for example, you asked a question previously, what is keeping or denying Aboriginal students from participation? You can talk to the students and see why they don't want to go to school, why they'd rather spend time mucking around in a shopping mall or sniffing glue or petrol, which is what they do on many of the communities. They can't afford anything else, and then they get brain damage from that. You can see what it is that the schools can do as institutions to keep them there longer. And hopefully they will then see in staying on in school, they can see the need for what we used to call, which is delayed gratification. You don't get much from school when you're there, but you know that if you don't go there, you're going to get nothing. But the gratification comes later, so it's delayed gratification. That was what we used to call it. And I certainly know that I was 21 when I went through the system, through school, through university, then teacher training. Finally, I had a job ticket at 21. In America, that's now something like 27, 28, 29 is the time that people finally get into the workforce. So I'm not advocating that everyone do that, but in fact, there was a debate at our university about whether there are too many people at university. I would question, are there too many of the same people at university?
Would you like to say something before we finish? Something you'd like to add?
I think that I've always I had a promotion interview just earlier this year, and I said that everything is for the students. And I think that as academics and as people working in education, we have to keep remembering that we always know far more than our students, and we have to often make decisions for them that. And remember that they're the next generation. We're already through the system in a way. So if we want to make things better, and we can't change the world, but we can change one or two things and make it a better place.
Thank you very much, Nigel. It was a fantastic interview.
Great pleasure.